in the world and who is who in America. Professor Borges was elected as a fellow of the Econometric Society in 1998 and the fellow of Society of the Labor Economics in 2024. Professor Borges' research, his own economic impact of immigration, is widely perceived as playing central role in the debate over immigration policy in the United States and abroad. Business Week and Wall Street Journal, in a front page featured article, have called him America's leading immigrant economist. A cover story in the New York Times magazine in 2006 focused on his work and called him the preeminent scholar in his field. In 2016, Politico listed Professor Borges as number 17 in the list of 50 thinkers, doers, and visionaries for telling his immigration policy to the world. He has appeared on many television news shows and testified before several congressional committees. He received his PhD in economics from Columbia University in 1975. And please join me in welcoming Professor Borges to 21st year of Bloomsburg University's Economic Lecture Series. Thank you for accepting us. Please welcome Professor Borges.
Thank you so much for that nice introduction. It's my second time here. Thank you for having me again. I really enjoy visiting this area, and thank you. And I guess today I'm here to talk about immigration, a topic that most of you know is somewhat emotional and in the press all the time, and very contentious. And I'm going to try to sort of give you a flavor for what the debate is about and where people stand on different issues and how it's reported, and what is it that we really know. And hopefully introduce a little humility into what people say about this, because the fact is we don't really have all the answers. And even though there's always a temptation to sort of run with whatever you believe to be true, this, it's much more nuanced than that. So one thing I hope to show you is the nuance behind the debate and how it is that reasonable people can actually disagree over what it is that we should be doing regarding this very, very emotional issue. And let me start by giving you what I call the economistic perspective of immigration. I'm an economist, so I'm trained to think of immigration from an economic perspective. And in the press, if you read about the immigration debate, a lot of it deals with economic issues. Those are issues that we tend to measure really well. And so people tend to use economic arguments one way or another to sort of support whatever they believe. And if you're trained as an economist, it is not far-fetched for you to think that immigration is like trade, okay, in some fundamental sense. Importing a widget is sort of equivalent to importing a few skilled workers that do the design work, a few unskilled workers to do the actual production, and it's sort of like the same thing. You're importing a widget that's already made, or you could import the labor that will produce the widget here domestically. So all you're really doing is changing where the thing is being produced. And from that perspective, immigration is very, very similar to trade. Once you stick to that way of thinking about things, all the costs and benefits that one attributes to immigration arise from the time that the immigrants who are now widget makers spend on the production line. They produce widgets, they do all kinds of things that benefit us in that sense. We buy them, we consume them, we benefit from the widgets, and so on and so forth, right? And it is seldom the case that people then begin to think about the impact immigration has on other parts of life. And the fact of the matter is they have impacts in every part of life. They have political impacts. They can change the way the political system works. They have votes. They have social impacts. They have cultural impacts. They affect everything. But if you stick to the argument immigration is like trade, you sort of focus on what happens on the production line and tend to ignore all the stuff that happens on the side. And if you're an economist, for a couple of centuries now, we've all been taught that trade is good. And that's something that is one of the things that distinguishes economics from a lot of other social sciences. And since immigration is like trade, it is not that big a leap of faith to say, well, if trade is good, immigration must be good. And that's sort of the way that we tend to think, that people who study immigration for the first time in economics, that's sort of the baggage they bring in when they begin to think about this. But there's a problem. And the problem is sort of summarized in that phrase. So in the 1950s and 1960s, Germany and other European countries began to import a lot of guest workers. Max Frisch, who is a very well-known Swiss essayist, writer, was sort of observing on this guest worker flow of millions of people into Germany and European countries. And he made a quip that I think is really the smartest thing anybody has ever said about immigration. And the quip was, we wanted workers, but we got people instead. And that, in a nutshell, is why the perspective of immigrants as a collection of widgets is just completely wrong. Immigrants are people. And people, the importation of people is fundamentally different than the importation of widgets. Why is that? Because people take actions. People do all kinds of things that widgets don't do. Moreover, when a widget breaks down, you can throw it out. When an immigrant, something happens, health issues, bankruptcy, all kinds of bad things can happen in life, right? You don't throw it out. That's not the right thing to do. So we have to worry about immigration in a different way than we would worry about trade. And that's sort of the fundamental lesson that I think we need to carry through when we think about immigration. We cannot think of immigrants as a collection of just raw labor inputs, which is, if you take in economics classes, which most of you have, you think of a production function, and capital labor is labor, doesn't really matter where people are born. Well, that's not quite the way to think about this. Immigrants are people that are just more than just a collection of robotic kinds of labor inputs. And the decisions immigrants make have all kinds of consequences. They have consequences on the culture, on the political system, on just way beyond whatever happens in the factory, in the widget factory itself. Just to give you an idea of the things that would happen, not everybody migrates. That's one of the things we know. Not everybody migrates. Even when there are no restrictions preventing people to move from one place to another, not everybody moves. So one of the things we have to worry about is which kinds of people are we getting? Which kinds of people is any country that opens up its border getting? And that's why you can come up with a little Star Wars sort of analogy here. Obi-Wan Kenobi would look at that and say, those aren't the people we're looking for. And it would not be inconceivable if the people who want to migrate into a given country and not precisely the type that the country needs or demands or is really looking for. And something to worry about. Immigrants choose whether or not to assimilate. I'll give you data of that in a minute, actually. The fact of the matter is that assimilation is a costly process. You have to learn the language. That's not free. You have to give up your old habits and culture. That's also not free. People like the way they grew up. And whether you assimilate or not, therefore, is a decision you make as an immigrant. And that decision has very important long-term consequences for the country. And we have to worry about that. We don't have to worry about that in the case of widgets. We could care less about whether widgets assimilate or not. Immigrants wear ethnic labels. Look at the European debate right now. And ethnicity matters for a very long time. We could care what the widget says about being produced in whatever country, right? But we definitely care, or should care, about the cultural contributions that immigrants are going to make, because they do wear ethnic labels, and ethnicity, we know, matters for many, many years. And immigrants live lives outside the factory gates. Not every benefit and not every cost depends on what happens in the widget production line. Just a trivial example, I was mentioning before, when immigrants sort of become unhealthy, we got to take care of them. That's not true for widgets. So therefore, immigrants have an impact on the welfare state. And they have an impact on the welfare state that could be very beneficial, there are more people to pay taxes, right? A lot of us are getting older. We have to retire. We're going to become unhealthy. Somebody's got to pay for all that. Immigrants can make a great contribution on that. At the same time, immigrants are people. They too will retire. They too will get sick. They too will need help. And we got to prepare for that as well. And that impact, again, doesn't exist when we think about immigration like a collection of robotic workers. It only comes in because immigrants are people. So what I want to do is sort of give you a sense of what that perspective tells us about the impact of immigration economically. And let me start with this, because this is sort of a way of framing the whole debate. Okay, Paul Collier is a very well-known English academic, sort of a public intellectual. He's a development economist by and large. So in his work, he has done a lot of books and articles on the impact of global warming, or the impact of development, and how can I say this easily? Just development in general, global warming, poverty, the reasons for poverty in different countries, and so on. He had never really done academic work on immigration. But a few years ago, he decided to write a book about immigration, okay, just out of the blue. He had never really done academic work on it, but he wrote a book. And he had to review the entire literature as he was preparing to write this book about immigration. The book is called Exodus: How Migration is Changing the World. And I love the quote. I mean, he actually argues that you have to worry about immigration because large flows of immigrants from particular countries could be problematic in the receiving country because they tend to bring in cultural issues that might be problematic, okay? I mean, it doesn't really matter what he says about immigration. What I found really fascinating about his reading of the literature is how he reacted to what he was reading as he was preparing this book. And his reaction is that quote: "A collection of xenophobes and racists lose no opportunity to argue that migration is bad." And all you have to do is pick up the paper and you'll see that, right? And understandably, this has triggered a reaction. Desperate not to give succor to these groups, social scientists have strained every muscle to show that migration is good for everyone. What he's basically saying is that there's been this narrative built in social scientists, certainly so in non-economic social sciences, but even in economic social sciences, where the data are presented or the arguments are argued in a way that make it look as migration is good for everyone. Migration is like manna from heaven. Everybody benefits. That's sort of the narrative that you tend to see in a lot of the work in social science. And how do you do this? You ignore the distinction between workers and people. I mean, that's one of the things you do. Immigrants are robotic workers that just move around and produce. You make assumptions. And as we all know, if we do social science, assumptions matter a lot. And you overlook inconvenient facts. So you tend to stress the things that push narrative one way. You tend to de-stress, to de-emphasize the things that push a narrative another way. This is not just true of immigration, by the way. This is true of practically any contentious social issue that you tend to see this narrative being built. But in immigration, it's particularly obvious, even to somebody who just reads the literature as he's trying to prepare the book. There's just this way of presenting the material in a way that you don't want to support the people who are xenophobes and racists. You sort of want to stress the fact that migration is really good for everybody in the end. And so let me, with that in mind, let me present some data, okay? This data is basically giving you the assimilation rate of immigrants. Different cohorts. Now, what do I mean by assimilation? Economists tend to use a very narrow lens through which to view assimilation. We tend to view it in terms of things we can measure. And the things we can easily measure in particular is how fast the wage of an immigrant grows as he adapts in the US labor market. So for example, immigrants, when they arrive, they might not know the language. They might not know where the good jobs are, right? They might not know where the best jobs are. But over time, they learn all that. And their wages go up. So each of these lines is telling you what happens to the wages of immigrants for a cohort as they get older, as compared to the wage of natives. So just to give you an idea of what I mean, look at the line for the 65, 69 arrivals, which is sort of the thick line up there somewhere, 65, 69. Everything is standardized. You start at 0. And by 20, 25 years later, they're making 15% more compared to natives than they used to make at the beginning. That's assimilation. You know, they adapted. Their human capital became more valuable. They learn English. They learn where the best jobs are. They learn what the best jobs are. And they took advantage of all that. And you can see that they did pretty well over time, right? Now, in fact, the disadvantage at entry for that cohort, the 65, 69 arrivals, was like 20% when they entered. So after 20 years, they caught up because their wages grew up by 20%. Okay? Same thing for the 55, 59 arrivals. Their wages were growing very rapidly, like 15% in the first decade. Unfortunately, the census data doesn't really allow you to track that group much longer because they just stop identifying the group, individually. But what we see is the very fast growth. Same thing for the late 70s arrival. You see that? A lot of growth. Same thing for the 30s arrivals, the late 1930s, right? Now, we only observed that group twice in census data. So you can only have 2 points, and that's what I connected there. But all these cohorts of immigrants did quite well as they adapted to the US. They did pick up whatever it is that American employers value. However, look at the bottom 2 lines. Those are the late 80s arrivals and the late 90s arrivals. Those bottom 2 lines are clearly not as steep. In fact, the late 90s arrivals is basically flat. So to the extent you believe census data, this is telling you something that it's important, number 1, and could be problematic in the future, number 2, right? It's basically telling you, yes, there's been a history of immigrants adapting very quickly to the US labor market. But something's happened. In the late 80s, for whatever reason, you tend to see that growth slowing down. Okay? And why that happened? This is still being very heatedly debated. We don't quite know why it happened. I'll give you one potential reason in a minute, but it happened. And this might have implications for how immigrants do in the next 30, 40, 50 years. I mean, the way to think about it is, immigration is a very contentious political issue. If this is true, even if we stop immigration today, the consequences of that will last for the next few decades. So we're going to be arguing about this for the next, in 2050. And that's something that, we should know about. There's something going on that has literally slowed down the rate at which immigrants sort of improve their economic well-being in the last 20 years. Now, you might say, well, we shouldn't worry about that because it worked out in the past. And you often see newspaper articles referring to the experience of the immigrants who came in the early 1900s. And we're here a century later. Whatever problems there were, it all worked out, right? It turns out that there are now economic historians who can revisit the past with new data. And you get a very different picture of what happened back then. So these economic historians, Rana Abramitsky, Bostan, and Erickson, they've written a series of papers using data from the census back in the early 1900s. Now, the nice thing about that data is that all that census data is now publicly available. And by that I mean the following. The actual manuscripts of the census data are available. So if you really felt like it, you could go into the web, find the manuscripts of those censuses, and find your ancestors in it by name. So you can find, for example, a guy called Alexander James. This is a real person. That person was born in Wales. He migrated to the US. You actually see him in 1800, you see him in 1910, you see him in 1920. You can actually trace him. And you can find out what he was doing in each of these three censuses. And you can actually just plot his assimilation path. What kind of work was he doing? And that's what Abramitsky, Bustan, and Erickson did. They literally found individual people in each of the censuses and just tracked them and tried to see whether the immigrants were adapting really rapidly the way that our mythic perception of the migration from Ellis Island sort of we have in our heads, right? It turns out that turned out not to be true. What the new work shows is that, quote, the notion that European immigrants converge with natives after spending 10, 15 years in the US is exaggerated, as we find that immigration-native occupational gaps persisted over time. So even a revisit now of the migration from the early 1900s looks much more like the bottom two graphs there, the bottom two lines there, right? We used to think it wasn't like that, but it's actually much more like that. So this is actually a major puzzle that we have to work through, okay? Because we don't really understand the reasons, but I'll give you the fact and I'll let you think about it, about what it all means. Only the immigrants who came in between the two great migrations. I mean, you think of the 20th century as a great migration in the Ellis Island era, and as a great migration today, right? Only the immigrants who came in between happen to be the ones that really improve their economic well-being really rapidly. The ones who came at the beginning, if you take the Abramitsky, Bustan, Erickson research at face value, didn't really improve all that much in their lifetime. The ones who are coming now, if you take the graph that I showed you earlier, it's not clear they're improving that much either. It's only the people in the middle. And the remarkable thing is that the 20th century, even though it was bookended by two great migrations, the middle actually saw very few immigrants. I mean, because of policy changes, because of the Great Depression, there was almost no migration between like the 1930s and the 1960s. So it is those groups where you see little migration that you see a lot of growth. And it is those groups where you see a lot of migration that you see weaker growth. And now then you can start thinking of all kinds of reasons, okay? You can think of all kinds of theories. And this is one potential reason for that. This is what the path looks, the pattern looks when you trace whether you learn English or not for a new immigrant, with how many immigrants like you there are in the US already. Okay, the ethnic enclave. Now, Eddie Lazier, who used to be the Bush CEA chair, actually has a very well-known paper back in the 1990s making this exact argument. The argument being the following: it is costly to learn English. You will only learn English if you have to. And when do you have to learn English? When there really aren't too many people like you around to communicate with. So if you come into the country and there are not many people like you around, in order to have social interactions, in order to have economic interactions, you have to learn English. If on the other hand you come here and you find a lot of people like you can interact with them. You can find jobs in the enclave. Everything you need is internally provided by the enclave. So what you can do is basically graph how fast people learn English, which is the vertical axis, to how big an enclave they can expect to find, which is the horizontal axis. And it's pretty clear. Big enclaves tend to diminish the rate at which people learn English. Now, you tell this result to anybody out in the real world, it's perfectly common sense, right? I mean, why would you do something that's costly when you don't have to? But think of what that means. It has all kinds of implications for the future. And some of them are good. The enclave is very, very beneficial for immigrants. It does provide a self-contained economy. They can interact with people that they prefer and that are, I shouldn't say they prefer, but interact with people that they have things in common with even before arriving. They can transact in their own language. They can find jobs in the enclave. the Enclave provides all kinds of social care and insurance for immigrants. So there's a lot of benefits. But it's also a cost, right? It sort of inhibits the fact, it inhibits immigrants from trying out there the real world. And that is costly. And we got to think as to which of these two things is better. I mean, it's not clear which is better for us, right? On the one hand, we would like immigrants to be happy and do what they want to do, which is, live in an area where they feel comfortable, where they can easily find jobs and so on. But on the other hand, you have to worry about the future as well. And that's what this kind of pattern tells you about. So this is and this is where the distinction between immigrants being people and, not robots comes in very handily, right? Immigrants make decisions. And one decision they make is whether it's worthwhile learning English. And depending on the situation, it might be or might not be. It's just a fact of life. Now, let me now get to the second issue that I want to talk about, which is extremely contentious, and that is the laws of supply and demand as applied to immigration, okay? The supply of oil goes up, the price of gas goes down. There probably isn't a single person in this room who would disagree with that. I mean, we know that intuitively. We've seen it at the gas pump, the prices, whenever you have, right now, with the hurricanes, we saw it in the price pumps, okay? Now, I want to apply that lesson to immigration. So I'm going to put a quote. Paul Samuelson, most of you have heard of him, was probably the most important economist, I think, of the 20th century. He wrote a dissertation called Foundations of Economic Analysis, which is really the foundation for the way economics is done today mathematically in a scientific sort of way. Okay? He also wrote a textbook. And the textbook was like, I don't know what textbook you use here, is a Mankey or something like that? Well, it's like, it was the Mankey of back then. That was the textbook that if people my generation went to college and took economics, that'd be the textbook they would have used. So what I did was to find Paul Samuelson's 1964 edition of the textbook. Now, why 1964? Because the policy regime that guides US immigration changed in 1965. It's that policy change that led to where we are now. So I wanted to see what an economist of Paul Samuelson's caliber had to say about immigration and supply and demand before any of this political contention had come into the debate. And what he said was this. Don't forget, he's writing in 1964. As I said earlier, between the 20s and between the Ellis Island era and 1964, very few immigrants had come in. And he says, look, after World War I, we passed laws that limited immigration, which we did. We wanted to restrict and sort of slow down and stop the Ellis Island migration. Laws were passed. Only a trickle of immigrants has been admitted since then, which is also true. By keeping labor supply down, immigration policy tends to keep wages high. Any supply-demand framework that you work out will tell you that. The supply of oil goes down or up, price of gas goes down. The supply of oil goes down, like it did recently with the hurricanes, the price of oil goes up. Okay? Now just imagine if you were writing something like that today. You would say, after 1965, laws were passed that greatly liberalized immigration. Many, many immigrants, a flood of them, if you want to be extreme about it, have been admitted since then. By keeping labor supply high, immigration policy tends to keep wages low. Now you write that today, and you're immediately into a big Twitter storm gets in shape, and all kinds of things can happen, right? But it's really the same statement. And even though it's the same statement, that because it's so contentious, that inference from the law of supply and demand is extremely disputed in the immigration context. Somehow, we are going to, we've seen a development where supply and demand works in many, many markets, but doesn't really work in the labor market. Because we don't want to rewrite the Paul Samuelson phrase in the way that we would have to rewrite it to sort of make, supply and demand make sense. So what I want to show you a few examples, okay, of supply and demand in this context. And the first example I want to show you is this one. I'm going to call it supply and demand in real life. This one, everybody can believe. There are no econometrics of any kind here. It's a newspaper ad. So there's no economist massaging data or working out equations, okay? So it's something that's just like, it just happened. And let me tell you the background behind this. So in September 2006, the George W. Bush administration was trying to enact an amnesty for undocumented immigrants. And to show, and to make the passage of the amnesty easier, they made an effort to enforce the laws against undocumented immigrants. So there was an enforcement boost behind this sort of enactment process, right? And as part of that enforcement boost, they began to raid factories all over the country. One factory they raided was a factory called Kreider, which processed chickens in Stillmore, Georgia. Okay? And this happened on Labor Day weekend. So over Labor Day weekend in September 2006, enforcement agents from the Immigration Department went to Kreider and began to look at the workforce and began to arrest people who were not documented in the US to work. That weekend, Kreider lost 75% of its 900 workers, okay? Because of this issue. You know, there were a lot of undocumented immigrants working there. The enforcement took place. All of a sudden, Kreider loses, you know, the bulk of its workforce. Now, I have a great quote from Samuel Johnson there. When a man's nose is to be hanged in a fortnight, he concentrates his mind wonderfully. Imagine being the manager of that Kreider factory. You wake up on Labor Day after the weekend and you realize you have a factory with no people to run it. So what do? You know, there's no labor left to run this factory. I have no idea what a chicken processing factory actually means, but I imagine there are chickens all over the place that you have to take care of, and you have nobody to take care of them. So what do? Well, what he did was to concentrate his mind, to revisit the law of supply and demand, and to put an ad in the paper. That's the actual ad that appeared in the local paper. And you can see from the actual ad, the main point is increased wages. You know, you cut supply down, what happens to wages? They go up. The same thing happened this summer, right? I remember reading several articles about how the Trump restrictions had cut the supply of a lot of workers to the US who did seasonal summer jobs, like in Cape Cod. There were articles in the Boston Globe about that. What did employers in Cape Cod do? They offered higher wages to native kids, to local kids to work and provide hamburgers and stuff like that for people who visit Cape Cod over the summer. And that's what happens. So the answer is not really, I talked about it this morning already, but I'll mention it again. A lot of people say immigrants do jobs they don't want to do. Look, who wants to work in a chicken processing plant at a low wage? The real thing to say is immigrants do jobs natives don't want to do at the going wage. That's a very different thing to say. Wages adapt. Supply goes up, supply goes down, wages adapt, just like we do in the textbook, okay? This is another way of looking at it. This is more data-oriented. This is after Mariel. Now, for those of you who don't know, Mariel, in 1980, Fidel Castro said, you can leave Cuba if you want, but you have to leave through Mariel. Mariel is a port outside Havana, and what Cuban Americans did was to rent and buy boats and begin a boat lift. And the boat lift began to bring people from Mariel to Florida. Almost overnight, in fact within 6 weeks, Miami's labor supply went up by 8%. That's a pretty big number. But even more important than that, most of the Mariel refugees were high school dropouts. So if you looked at what happened to the high school dropout labor market in Miami, the number of high school dropouts looking for jobs went up by 20% in 6 weeks. And what happens is, well, that's what happens. This is what happens to the wage of high school dropouts in Miami as compared to outside Miami right after 1980, when the Mariel boat lift took place. You can see a pretty big drop. You know, a lot more high school dropouts, you tend to see an impact. Now that impact eventually goes away, so markets adjust. That impact eventually goes away. By the way, the other big drop down there is another Mariel-like flow that happened in the mid-90s. So the two big drops there, you can actually correlate to an influx of, a very rapid influx of Cuban low-skilled workers into the Miami area. And now, this is where I was telling you before, there is a lot of contention in the immigration literature about how things are. And this is where you begin to get contentions. It's hard to argue against this. That's just an ad. You can literally go to the local paper and Xerox it, and you have the ad. This depends much more on data and on the decisions that people make about looking at data. That's a graph from one of my papers. Now, literally within 3 months after that graph came up publicly, there were papers already criticizing the graph because you can spin the data in a different way and you get a different answer. So I'm going to have a few of these slides showing you different ways of doing things. To sort of go back to the Collier point of how it is you can take the same data and come up with very different conclusions. So the left-hand side graph is my graph from my paper. The right-hand side graph is a graph from a paper that was written 3 months later to criticize my paper. And you can see that the two graphs tell very different stories, right? They use exactly the same data, but they tell very different stories. The data is the March CPS, March Current Population Surveys. And then the question becomes, which one should we believe? And then to do that, you have to get into the footnotes of the paper and into the fine print of the paper, right? And see exactly what it is that's being done. So let me tell you what exactly is being done. And you can then, I'm not going to tell you which one to believe. I want to leave it up to you, okay? And I'm going to have 3 of those things. So I'm going to leave it up to you, and you decide on your own which one is more sensible. So the way I did it was to look at men. So you can see in curtain number 1 is male, non-Hispanic, high school dropouts, age 25 to 59. Okay? That was a sample I looked at when I did my paper. The other paper is looking at all non-Cuban high school dropouts, age 16-61. Now, if I don't tell you anything about this, both of these things look fine. It's just a matter of choice, right? Well, let me tell you where the subtleties are. I looked at men. The other paper looks at all, meaning they look at men and women pooled, right? In economics, in labor economics, it's unusual to look at men and women pooled because we know that men and women differ in their labor market earnings. Not only that, we know that many women don't work, and therefore the actual average earnings of women is contaminated by selection bias, which sample of women work. Even worse than that, we have to worry about the fact that over time, women have worked more, right? The participation rate of women has increased a lot, especially in the 1980s. So ideally, what you want to do in these graphs is track the average person over time, right? And that average isn't, it's the same person on average. When you add women into the sample, many, many more women were working in the late 80s than were working in the early 80s. So the meaning of an average differs because now you have a person at the beginning of the sample, the average person was 0.3 female. By the end of the sample, it could be 0.5 female. And because wages differ between men and women, that will lead to a sample composition effect. Now, as an aside, it turns out that the rate at which men and women work over time changed, for women particularly, in this period, but it was particularly changing in Miami. Believe it or not, Miami's fraction of women working barely budged in those years, even though in the rest of the country was increasing rapidly. So that basically it sort of twists the data a little bit, right? Depending which way you do it. Let me do the second one, non-Hispanic, non-Cuban. I'm sorry, yeah, look at non-Hispanic, they looked at non-Cuban. Ideally, what you want to do is look at natives. I mean, what you really want to do is what happened to native earnings in Miami of high school dropouts over the period, right? Unfortunately, that data do not exist. The data that we're using here, the CPS at the time, doesn't ask where people are born. So you have to approximate it. And it makes a big difference which we approximate it. The problem with using, I use non-Hispanic, they use non-Cuban. What does it really mean? What that really means is you're adding Mexicans into the data. But don't forget, the 1980s was a period where many, many Mexican immigrants came in. So think of Los Angeles. LA in 1980 had some immigrants, but not that many. By 1990, LA had many more immigrants, Mexican immigrants. If you add those Mexican immigrants to the data, the LA wage will go down. Just like Miami's wage went down, making these two things more alike. So again, what do you mean by the average differs over time? And last but not least, I looked at 2559. They look at 1661. You know, again, why should that matter? Well, that matters for a simple reason. These data do not ask you if you're in school or not. So when you add 16, 17, 18-year-old people to the data, you know, a lot of you are just beyond that, they're actually adding you a few years later, a few years ago. And just think of yourself as a high school senior, 18-year-old high school senior. This is a March CPS, don't forget. In March of your senior year, the CPS will come to your house and ask you, what's your education? Do you have a high school diploma? And you will say, no. You're about to graduate 3 months later, but you'll actually say no because you don't have one. By definition, you're a high school dropout because you don't have a high school diploma. You have less than 12 years. There are so many kids in high school in this country that adding those kids contaminates the data a lot. Now, again, you know, I just want to show you how easy it is to get completely different pictures of what's going on, just by making what at face value seem like very sensible changes. And I'm going to show you that again in a few minutes, okay? Now, I won't do this here, but you've all seen graphs like this in class. You know, areas, triangles, consumer surplus, producer surplus, and stuff like that, right? You can do the same thing for immigration. And what you can do for immigration is take that graph and actually put numbers in all those areas. And this is a table that comes out of that graph, okay? Immigrants come in, they lower the wage, they make employers more profitable. But just like with trade, the people who gain more than the people who lose. That creates an immigration surplus. And all the numbers that come out of that model are in that graph. So the model basically tells you the surplus is 50 billion a year, the loss to native workers is 500 billion, the gain to native firms is 500 billion, the total increase in GDP is $2 trillion, but most of that goes to immigrants. They get, you know, immigrants don't work for free. That's what the model tells you. Now again, you don't have to take these numbers at face value. These are the numbers that come out of a simple supply-demand framework, which for better or worse are taken at face value. What I want to show you is how the press reports those numbers. In 2016, the National Academy of Sciences published a 500-page report where they did this model, and they report these numbers. This is the report from that National Academy report. These are the press reports. So what I did here was to take 3 screenshots of how the press reported those numbers. Now don't forget, the model tells you all these numbers. None of them come individually. They all come as a package. If you believe one, you have to believe all. Okay? And this is how the press reported the National Academy. One paper said, 2 trillion reasons why immigrants make America great. And they're obviously referring to the 4th number there, right? Total increase in GDP, $2 trillion. No, immigrants increase GDP, by definition. More people, more work, more widgets, right? The second number refers to the National Academy hides a $500 billion immigration tax. That's the loss to native workers. The reason they use the word hide is because the National Academy didn't report 500 billion just like that. They made it hard for you to find. They reported the percent. You got to get it back of an envelope, multiply the percent times GDP, and then you get 500 billion. But it's there. The bottom one is from the New York Times. And you can see the highlighted thing that says the National Academy will release a report that the immigrant surge to the US produced net benefits to the native born beyond those accruing to the immigrants themselves of $50 billion a year, right? Which is another number, the $50 billion surplus. Okay, all these things are true. They're all false, also at the same time, right? Because they're all incomplete. The complete thing is all this happened at the same time. And depending who you read and which paper you read, you get you get one slice of what's really going on, whereas this is the total thing that happened. Okay? Now one last of these things. This is a lot of very contentious debate about whether immigrants use welfare or not, right? Okay. It is not hard. Believe me, I can do this in 10 minutes, and I do it in class to show students. You can do this in 10 minutes to generate 2 graphs showing you completely different conclusions using the same exact data. If you look at the left-hand side, immigrants use welfare a lot more than natives, right? If you look at the right-hand side, it doesn't really matter. Let me repeat again. This is using exactly the same data. Okay? CPS data from 1994 on. All that differs is that the left-hand side is using households, the right-hand side is using persons. Okay? Now why, again, it's one of these things that unless somebody explains it to you what's going on here, you can pick whichever graph you want and make a choice out of that, right? Well, let me tell you what's really going on. Suppose you're an immigrant woman. You come to the US as a young woman, and you marry somebody, and you have 3 kids. The guy leaves you. 5 years later, you end up in financial straits. All kinds of things happen to people. You need help. The welfare system is there for you to help you, and they help you. If you look at it as a household, that woman and her 3 kids will be called an immigrant household. So in the left panel, that unit that I just told you about will be in the immigrant category, right? In the right panel, you're doing it at a personal level. That household is composed of 4 people. 1 immigrant and 3 kids born in the US. Well, those 3 kids born in the US will be called natives. So you're now putting the allocation between immigrants and natives. And you get, doesn't matter. And that's the kind of thing that gets done all the time when you report this kind of data. So, I'm not telling you what to believe, but if you really want to get into this debate and understand it, it is almost impossible unless you read the footnotes and what it is that people actually do to get the data they get. Because you can see, you can get very, very different stories of what is going on, depending on the definition of what it is an immigrant, what it is that is a native. Now, the National Academy has estimated all this, the cost of the fiscal impact, and they came up with a cost of around $57 billion annually. Because, the National Academy actually chose the left-hand side as sort of the sensible way of looking at it. So they're looking at the household level, an immigrant and the children of that household as being the immigrant household. And when you do it that way, given that graph, it's not inconceivable that immigrants on average, are costly. And they actually have numbers. They actually have like 12 scenarios, depending which one you want to believe. But the numbers go all the way from 50 to 300 billion. Now, don't forget that the surplus, one more thing I want to say before I get to the surplus. This is all the short run. In other words, how much taxes do immigrants pay now versus how much they provide. And that's what you get. But that actually misses a big part of the picture. Because when immigrants come in, we have an aging population in this country, right? We're going to retire. we're going to get sick. We're going to need people to pay taxes to be able to support us. So you can see immigration as a way of bringing in more taxpayers that will help us, right? And so they actually tried to quantify that. And the problem with that is you can get whatever answer you want. So this is a straight from the National Academy. I took 4 numbers from their table to sort of show you what it is you want to conclude. I mean, if you want to conclude that in the long run, immigrants are great, there'll be a number that allows you to do that. If you want to conclude that immigrants are not so great, there's a number that allows you to do that. So I gave you 4 numbers there, and you can pick the one you want. And again, it's all a matter of assumptions. That's where assumptions come in. So there are 2 different assumptions you make. On the vertical part of it, you have to assume, in order to project into the future, you have to know something about the future. Like, what do we know about government expenditures, about government income over the next 75 years, which is what they did. Assume something about the next 75 years. In one column, you assume whatever the CBO assumes, the Congressional Budget Office. Now, that might sound like a sensible thing to do, but if you recall reading the paper for the last couple of years, the CBO can barely predict enrollment in Obamacare 6 months later. So whether they can predict the economy of the US 75 years from now, it's questionable. The other column is, let's just keep going the way we are. Whatever we spend now, all the commitments we have, they keep going forever. And that makes a difference. You can see the lines, right? You can make a huge difference. The vertical rows has to do with what you assume about immigration and the cost of public goods. If you let one more immigrant into your community, providing fire services, police protection, doesn't really go up all that much. But if you let 10,000 immigrants coming in, that might change, right? If you're letting 1 immigrant in the US, the cost of defense might not change. You're letting 40 million, it might change. You have to make an assumption about that. And the 2 rows is they don't increase the cost, or they cost just as much as us. And you can basically you can see. You can get 4 numbers there, from plus 58,000 to minus 119,000. All depending on assumptions that we really know nothing about. Because we don't really know the future. We don't really know what the US will look like economically 50 years from now. And we don't know what the cost of public goods is. We just don't have a good sense of that. So the point is, it is not that difficult to emphasize particular numbers and de-emphasize others to get a story going the way you want it to go. And unfortunately, one has to be very careful when one draws lessons from this literature because of that. Let me conclude by just summarizing what I think I've learned from this, okay? The surplus, the increase in the pie, is $50 billion. We remember the New York Times story that I mentioned earlier? That's a $50 billion. The National Academy basically says also that the welfare cost, the fiscal impact, is also $50 billion at least. If you think about it that way, it doesn't really matter. We gain 50 billion, we lose 50 billion. On net, it doesn't matter. But just because on net it doesn't matter, doesn't mean that it doesn't matter for everybody. It matters for some of us. The people who win, people who gain from immigration, and the employers who hire low-skilled immigrants, they are laughing all the way to the bank. The people who lose, the people who compete with immigrants, the low-skilled workers who have to compete with a much larger workforce, they're paying for that. And that's what immigration is about. It's really a debate over redistribution. Some people win, some people lose. Now again, if you look at it from an unemotional, unpolitical perspective, this is nothing new, okay? Nothing in the world can make everybody better off. Everything has a price and a cost, opportunity cost, right? Everything, that's what economics is about. Not everything can make everybody better off. Immigration is not manna from heaven. There's things are going to happen. Some people will benefit, some people will lose out, and we have to worry about that. And that's what the debate is about. And that explains where the money goes in Congress. You want to know who benefits, You follow who it is that's paying for lobbying to have more immigrants. You want to know who's losing, you follow the group that argue against it. And unfortunately, that leaves me at the end with something that's not very rewarding as a lesson, but it's really the truth, which is this quote. Any immigration policy you adopt is implicitly making a statement, not only of how much we care about immigrants versus natives, but about how much we care about this group of natives versus that group of natives. In the end, the choice of an immigration policy is really a choice that's trying to answer the question, who you're rooting for. You know, not everybody can benefit. Different immigration policies will benefit different people. Different immigration policies will harm different people. And we got to make a choice of what it is we care about. The debate over immigration will be much more honest and much more useful if at the beginning of anybody ever talking about it, we made them say who it is you're rooting for, who it is you care about. Look, there's no right answer to that. Some of us will care about native workers. That's fine. Some of us will care about native firms, especially if you own the firm. That's fine too. Some of us will care about the immigrants. We want to give immigrants a chance at the American dream. I mean, look at it another way. Over the last 30, 40 years, we've let in many, many immigrants, right? We've let in many, many low-skilled immigrants. From one perspective, that's an incredibly generous thing to do. What we've been doing in the US for the last 30 years is provide an entry into the American dream for tens of millions of people who had almost no opportunities. That is the greatest anti-poverty program ever known in the universe. You know, that's an incredibly commendable thing to say about that. It takes a great country to do something like that. But let's not pretend that that came in without a cost. You know, somebody paid for that. And we have to worry about that. So the question becomes, who are you rooting for? You have to worry about all these groups in setting up an immigration policy. And unfortunately, the data are not perfect. Unfortunately, the data can be easily manipulated one way or another, depending on which side you're on. And it leaves you basically, you know, it leaves you with a normative kind of objective function. You have to tell us who it is that what it is you want the country to look like before immigration policy is decided, because the data itself is not going to help very much. Both because it doesn't matter, I mean, it's a normative question, and also because it can be manipulated so easily. And that is where the immigration policy debate is today. Even though it's very contentious, the issue that really is at the core of all this, which is that question: what is it that we want to accomplish? Who is it that we want to help? That question really goes unanswered all the time. Thank you very much.